everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn. I had such a busy August that was crazy, so I'm really behind on everything, my quilting jobs, even doing estimates for people, and certainly with posting videos. So I'm really interested. This is a vintage quilt that I got for a client, and I don't know if you can see, it's a summer weight quilt, so all hand sewn, and it's just got muslin on the back, which is great for summer weight. But she wants this re-backed, and I'm gonna add batting to it according to what she wanted, which is gonna preserve all of the hand stitching and re-tack and stabilize where some of these seams, a lot of times hand sewn seams, there's a little more space between the stitches, the stitch length tends to be longer, and you lose fabric in the seams to fray. So we're going to preserve all of that, put a new backing on there, and she wants the puff poly backing in here, puff poly batting in here. But there's a few interesting things about this quilt. So instead of on the sides, these were seamed together in the way, some people call it a French seam or the pillow flip or like a French flip, where you sew the right and wrong sides together and turn it inside out. It looks like that was done on the sides, but on the end, the top was rolled to the back and hand stitched down as the binding there. And then on the back, obviously this muslin piece wasn't big enough to do this full width, so you do have some, it's kind of like sashing, but actually, you know what, I think these might have been smaller quilts that were made separately and then joined with a sashing. So these two units were probably made individually and then joined together, because this edge is finished and this edge is finished, but the edge of the sashing piece is not finished there. So that's interesting. And here the muslin backing is pieced going this way. So it looks like they did this in strips and then joined the strips with sashings that are only, this is one layer of fabric thick right here in the sashing. Right here, there's nothing, there's no backing at all. And then one thing I noticed, and I thought I was missing a block. So this corner doesn't have it. Which corner had it? Ah, this corner has a cutout. And I thought I was missing a block, but this is actually rolled over and finished and bound in that same method where they roll the top to the back. This is a little bit like that Japanese method, because this is just the sashing, there's no backing on this edge. So I think this might have been when you make the bed and you have the corner post of the bed frame, and this part would have laid down on, say, the side, and this would have laid down on the back. So you don't have to tuck in to the bed frame, you can just have the bed post stick out. So I think that's what that's for. And then, does it have it on the next corner? See, it only has that on one corner though. So really interesting. I'm not quite sure if that was a design choice because it's finished, or did they have a block get torn and then just come back and finish this so it wouldn't be a raw edge? I really don't know. If any of you have seen something like this, it's only in one corner. If it were in two corners, I would be convinced just to let the bedposts stick out. But anyways, let's have a look. So this is not vintage style. This is real vintage. And it's real scrappy. These fabrics would have been collected, maybe sheets that have a little hole in it, curtains that had a fade spot, but the rest of the fabric is good. Clothing, there's definitely some clothing. The seam in this yellow lets me know that this had been an article of clothing, probably a little blouse or dress. This green and white fabric feels a little bit heavier. This may have been like upholstery. Very interesting. So we're gonna do on this one the Quilty BBL, which is rebacking a quilt, and it preserves the original quilting, which means you do not have to pick the quilting. If it's dense machine quilting, we all know what a job that is. If it's hand quilting, to me it's important to preserve the handwork of those that have passed on. This would have been done by a grandmother who's no longer with us. So you're keeping the hand of the generations that have gone before. And you can do several things with the binding. You can cut off the binding when you're going to do a BBL. You can pick it. Just going around the outside and picking with hand stitching would not be as much work. And unroll it and then rebind it in the usual way. And you can actually enclose it. Let's say you do a large enough backing that you can do a rolled binding or a strip binding, and then enclose the old binding in a new binding. So this quilt behind me that is going to be repaired, there's I'm gonna have to redo the applique in a lot of places and patch a couple of holes in that. This is not getting a full Quilty BBL, but it is getting a new binding, and I'm going to enclose the old binding in that. I'm not going to cut that bias binding off, and it's got a scalloped edge. I'm not sure how well you can see. So I'm gonna just cut a bias binding, make it a little bit wider so that I can fully enclose. Make sure I don't have any old and new binding like peeking out. That's how that one's gonna be. So this one, because it's done differently on the different sides, I don't want to cut it. I think I'm going to enclose this as well. So if you're doing the enclosed method, you do have to think about whether or not you're hand sewing in that area, because then you really do have a lot of layers and a lot of, so I've got here, I've got a join of the patchwork top, and then it's folded over twice to make like a little thin hem, like a narrow hem here. And then in this spot, I've got where it's folded over to join the sashing. So there will be bulk, and then I'm going to be adding the extra layers of my binding. So you kind of have to think, if you're going to hand sew there, to be a little bit careful about how quickly you let those layers add up. But I think I'm just going to take the binding a little bit wider and avoid all this stitching. This will be inside the binding, and where I'm actually stitching will be here. I'm not going to try to stitch on top of all these layers and seams. I'm going to try to stitch here. So yeah, the binding's going to be a little bit thicker, but all that handwork is still there. It's inside. In the old days, it was very common for the batting of a new quilt to contain an old quilt. So it might be tattered, the seams are starting to pop, and they would use an older quilt as part of the next quilt. And that usually worked, because as the kids grow and the beds get bigger, they would put the old quilt inside and then sort of patch in extra batting. And the history of batting is really interesting. There was a day when a lot of that was like horsehair, but I talked to some older quilters when I was starting out, and they made all of their quilts were basically scrap quilts from clothing, draperies, sheets, things that had worn out but still had some usable real estate, and then any little bits that they trimmed off, like the felled flat seams of the jeans, like the heavy side seams of a jean, or all the stuff that I would cut off and throw away because it's thick and textured and not really conducive to making a nice flat quilt block. They actually threw that loose into the quilt, and that formed the batting. So it was more of a loose stuffing. And I imagine the construction of those quilts, based on what they told me, was more like what we see in a puff quilt today, where you're actually sewing individual like little square pockets, and then poly puff goes into each of those little biscuits. You can sew the whole thing and then sew them together, or kind of the method I like is you have basically a whole cloth. I mean, it can be pieced, but you can load that on a long arm or do it on a sit-down domestic machine, and you sew the bottom and you sew the tubes for a certain manageable distance, and then you stuff poly puff down those tubes, and then you sew across to create the grid shape, and then you can advance it and move on to the next manageable section. How big is a manageable section? It depends on your machine. Are you using a long arm or a sit-down domestic, and how much smush and push do you want to do? But basically you sew a reasonable section of columns with just your top and your backing, stuff that with poly puff, and then come across the other way to turn those columns into grids. And so their quilts were largely like that. The top and back were sewn together in small little pockets, and then they stuffed in everything they trimmed off the fabric. I mean, this is people who were really using everything. They were getting every last bit, really living that waste not, want not. And then sew it shut and do the next layer and sew it shut. So really interesting. And then now we have more modern fancy battings that can come in sort of any fiber content and density and puffiness that you want. There's silk battings on a roll, there's wool battings, bamboo battings. I have some customers who really like the bamboo. I generally stick with an 80-20 cotton poly blend. It gives a nice crisp antique finish that honors a lot of these vintage quilts, or like classier quilts look really nice with the more antique style look of the 80-20. But if you go 100% cotton, the weight difference to get that same loft is enormous. So in the South, we tend to find those all cotton quilts to be heavy, like heavy. So that little 20% of poly gives you a little more loft and definition for your quilting to show up, which if you're paying for a long arm, I assume you want to see the quilting, and it gives you less weight. So when you're handling and storing those quilts, it's a little bit easier. So you get a little loft in exchange for a little weight when you add that little bit of poly. And I think the 80% in our house, we find that it doesn't have any, it feels like a cotton quilt when you're using it. It doesn't have enough poly that you're gonna feel like it's clammy or like you're wearing a plastic bag. You know, you don't have that plasticky poly feel against your skin. It has plenty of breathability. And then the poly puff is fun. It's great for kids' quilts. And if you are doing a quilt for display or you really want to stack, it gets heavy fast even if you use 2 layers of the 80-20. So adding 80-20 stacked with a poly puff, or about the most I would do is 80-20 poly puff, 80-20. So you get the cottony feel on both sides of the quilt, but you're getting a lot of sort of free loft. You're adding almost no weight, getting plenty of poof. That's very manageable for my machine. It looks great. Now that creates a quilt with a lot of body. So this quilt is all drape. If you did 3 layers of batting in this, and I let go of this corner, it would like stay out like a flag in the wind, fully like stiff. So that's another thing you have to think about. Poofiness adds that beautiful definition to the quilting, but as far as usability, puffy quilts like that are really great for a play mat if it's for a baby who's going to be spending tummy time, but it's not gonna do this and drape and be soft and floppy in the same way. So ways to make it more drapey and soft and floppy is use a lower loft batting. Something like bamboo or cotton is going to have more drape because those are lower loft, a little bit thinner, a little bit less poly content, a little bit less dense on the stitching, on the quilting will give it a little more drape. Real dense quilting tends to trap the batting and create like a network that gives it body. And certain fabrics are drapier, like minky is quite drapey, it's heavy, and I guess it's not going to support its own weight, so it's going to collapse down and create that like drape. So less drapey quilts are great for tummy time and floor play. Some of my quilt patterns look sort of map-like, and so if you're going to play on top of that with your little Matchbox cars and trucks and whatever, those are great because it's elbows and knees. Dog beds, something that's going to pull up on the bed and you don't want any wrinkles in it, is great to have a little bit more body for like a bedspread type use. Something that's going to be displayed on a wall. Those are great reasons to have a quilt with more body that's going to hold its shape and be less prone to wrinkling. But if you're on the couch doing this and you want it to collapse to you, then what you are looking for is a little bit more drape. Kind of covered that on my batting episode, so I don't know that I needed to prattle on that long about drape and body, but it seems to come up a lot. So we're going to do a Quilty BBL on this, and I'll do a video kind of showing how it goes and how it turns out, so you can see that. It is a great way to, this quilt would have a lot of, so I don't know if you can see here, a lot of the seams have popped. So not virgin fabric tends to have a looser weave because it's just loosened up from use. And then a lot of fabrics that are used for clothing, like shirting, like men's shirting, is a looser open weave. It's thin so it can be airy so they don't sweat to death trying to work in the summertime. But the side effect of that is it does fray very easily. And so if you didn't go in and like finish every single seam on the inside, you're eventually going to have fray and pop through. And with hand quilting, it's not as stabilized by the quilting because there's just not as much of it. So I can come back with the long arm and stabilize these down and not lose fabric. Because if I had to go in and take the seam apart and re-sew it, I would have to go in a new seam allowance because the seam allowance is gone. It's just fibers, and the quilt would get smaller, and then parts that did get repaired are smaller, parts that didn't get repaired are the same size, so now they're like not fitting. So the best way to do that is just tack it down with new quilting. And if you've got enough fabric for that, and if you don't, you can usually slip a little bit of a patch in there, and you can put something on top, like a little piece of ribbon. You can sneak a little piece of interfacing underneath sometimes if you have enough thread, enough yarns of the fabric left to make it hide that interfacing. You can beef it up on the inside by tucking a little piece of interfacing in there. When I have tops that do not have a back, I'll use peel and stick interfacing to hold all those in place and keep the fibers tucked and a finished folded over edge, and then just quilt the heck out of it, and that'll keep it down. And with quilts that are repaired, you do have to remember that that quilting pattern is some about making the quilting look beautiful, but like here, this is where the sashing was, and it's not just popped through, but there's no backing there, so it's popped all the way through. So I would have to put a little something there. So I'm going to have to quilt along this line. So if I wasn't planning on quilting a straight line there, I kind of have to. So quilting on a repair quilt is a little bit about making the quilting look beautiful, but a little bit about the mechanics and restoring the structure of the quilt. So sometimes you end up having to put a little straight line somewhere that you normally wouldn't. On the front of the quilt, it's going to be hidden by the seam and you won't notice it as much. But sometimes when you flip to the back, you'll have kind of this organic, maybe feathery pattern going along, and then just a straight line cruising across, and that is part of the repair, part of fixing that. But it's not that noticeable. You'd have to be looking for it to see it. I mean, it's visible, but you have to be looking for it, and it maintains the quilt so nicely that usually it's worth it. All right, have a great day. Bye. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give us a comment. Tell me if you've ever tried this Quilty BBL method before, which is just putting a new back on it. But I like to call it a Quilty BBL. So give us some comments about that. Like us. That lets other quilters know that you enjoyed our video. And subscribe so that you can see the next installment where I will be working on this quilt and showing how it turned out in the end. And you can also check out, we have a brand new pattern shop. So it's etsy.com/shop/LongarmingByJaclyn. And that's everywhere. We're Longarming by Jaclyn. Google, YouTube, Facebook, except on our Instagram, it's Massey.jc. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll change that, fix it. Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.